This parable, I find it fascinating. I don't really think, when I think of parables, I don't really think of this one. I'm not even sure I've heard very many sermons on it, but it is very thought-provoking. The writer of Luke places this parable amidst the other parables that we have heard over the past several weeks. Jesus is trying to explain what is important in life and what is futile, how salvation comes to those who listen and how others reject it. Our story has two main characters, as you have heard, the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man wore lots of purple, and no, he wasn't a TCU fan. But in those days, well, I think in his days, purple was very rare. It was so rare, it was actually regulated by Roman law. The more status you had, the more purple you could wear. And with our rich man wearing a lot of purple, he must have been very rich and had a lot of very elite. But the more he isolated himself in a gated house, and when others around him were hungry and scraping for food, he ate sumptuously. Our poor man was called Lazarus, which in Hebrew means God helps. I think this is not a real person, a real man named Lazarus, but a representation of the ones who were desperate for God's help. Lazarus sat outside of the rich man's house, where I imagine he could be seen every time the rich man ventured outside. Lazarus lived a miserable life. He was desperate for God's help, and eventually he received that help. He died and was comforted in the arms of Abraham, the father of the Jewish faith. You can imagine what message this was for the Pharisees, who were faithful followers of the Jewish laws and traditions. When the rich man died, he didn't go to Abraham in comfort, but to a place of heat and discomfort. The man accustomed to comfort in life was faced with enduring discomfort in the afterlife. The poor on earth found comfort and relief after death, while the rich on earth found enduring misery. That's at least how the parable was told. If you remember the Jewish concept of blessing, you can understand the Pharisees' point of view. They regarded wealth as a sign of God's pleasure. If you were in good graces with God, God rewarded you with abundance of wealth and good health. This reminds me of the preacher in Houston who teaches this message. God will bless you with good health and riches and success if you are faithful. If this perspective is right, then the opposite must be true. If you are in disfavor with God, God will curse you with misery and poverty and poor health. You will not be among the elite, but pushed to the margins of society. This is how the rich man and Lazarus were viewed by the Pharisees and the Jewish community. But this parable, Jesus turns tradition upside down. The rich received their reward on earth and were doomed to misery after death, while the poor who lived in misery on earth were rewarded with comfort after death. So how do you see yourself? Who do you think you are? What is your identity? We live in America, in the United States, we must be Americans. We live in Texas, so are we Texans?
Yeah.
What other identities do you have? Is your identity based on what you do for a living? Is it based on where you went to school? Are you a longhorn or a horned frog or a golden hurricane or a Sooner or a cowboy? How are your thoughts and actions a response to your perceived identity? Do you cheer for one team and curse another? Do you take pride in being an American and vilify other countries? Who do you think you are? There's actually a TV show by that very name, Who Do You Think You Are? Have any of you seen it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. Each episode features a celebrity from sports or movies, and with the help of Ancestry.com, they seek answers to questions about their past. They learn about long ago ancestors who lived on the other side of the world, and they hear stories of a family member they never knew. Through this search, they not only learn of the past, but they learn more about who they are by knowing who their ancestors were. By knowing the past, it forms their identity in the present. Whether we want to admit it or not, our family is part of who we are. Not only who we are, but how we view the world. I grew up in the South with white parents who were college educated. We lived in a middle-class neighborhood surrounded by people who looked like us. We were not wealthy, but had a nice house and cars and clothes as we needed them. This is what I was accustomed to and what I took for granted. My perspective was of a middle-class white female living a life of security. I may not have been the rich man, but I was not Lazarus. It was many years before I realized my perspective was based on one of white privilege. I could be expected to be welcomed and have a welcome response when I went shopping or applied for an apartment or argued a traffic ticket. In a way, I am that rich man. I live comfortably and expect to live comfortably. What's wrong with that? If we listen to this parable, we learn that living comfortably and ignoring those who are anything but comfortable is not demonstrating the message of Christ. Ignoring suffering of others is not seeking justice. Accepting it is okay for homeless to live in sweltering heat or freezing cold is not offering radical hospitality. Vilifying other religious and cultural groups is not sharing radical faith grace. On Friday, I attended a seminar. It was entitled Finding Hope in the Midst of Communal Suffering. We were presented with real-life scenarios and asked how our congregations reacted to them. One was the massacre at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, and the other was the shooting of the 3 police officers in Dallas. The leaders asked us to think about these questions. Were the incidents discussed in church, or were they just a line in the pastoral prayer? Did we make judgments about the victims or the persecutors? Were some deserving or undeserving of our assessment? On the surface, this seems simple enough until we realize our response was based on our identity and our point of view. As I mentioned before, my point of view is of a middle-class white woman of privilege. I evaluated the scenarios through the lens of my identity and experience. But I think this parable asks us to look through different lenses when we see someone else or make a judgment of others. In our story, the rich man never really sees Lazarus. Even though Lazarus is sitting at his gate and has probably walked right past him when he ventures outside of his walled home. I doubt he even considers Lazarus' life of pain and misery. After all, the rich man is blessed, and Lazarus is cursed. What more is there to consider? But that is the exact point I believe this parable from Jesus is making. If you are privileged and comfortable, you may be rich. You may be the rich man. If you see others as deserving punishment and misery, you may view life as this rich man did. These are harsh valuations, but that is the point of the seminar, and I think the point of this parable. Often this parable is viewed as a salvation story. The rich man in hell asked Lazarus in heaven to send a messenger to his family so they will repent from their arrogant behavior and receive an eternity of misery as he has. I love the sarcasm in the response, that even if a man rose from the dead, he still would not convince others to change their ways. But that is what Jesus is about to do, that very same thing. He is skeptical that this will be persuasive to this hard-hearted people. In other words, even the act of resurrection will not bring salvation to those who don't understand. I see salvation as being saved by the grace of God through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. For me, this is the gospel story. This is the good news from God. But through much thought and study, I have come to see salvation is not merely personal, but communal as well. Salvation can be life-giving in community by changing our attitudes and rethinking our embedded theologies. We can bring salvation to the church. What if the church, in the midst of bigotry, asked the hard questions? What if it offered radical hospitality to others, all others? What if it blessed others who others refused to bless? What if it offered hope in the midst of communal suffering? Could this create salvation in a world of division and animosity? I think it could. So what is this parable saying? Who is the rich man? Who is Lazarus? Who are we? And how do we offer grace and hospitality to a world in pain? I suggest we be the church. Not the church of unbendable tradition and ritual, but the church of radical hospitality and grace. We be the church that listens to the cries of anguish and sees the tears of despair. We be the church that asks the hard questions and doesn't accept simple answers. We be the church that is the pathway to salvation for a divided community. What we always need for ourselves, love and grace and hope, we offer others. For that same love and grace and hope is offered to us every day by the one who sends a path to salvation, if we only follow. Amen.
Amen.